thank you for being here today with us. My name is Charlotte Charlier, and I'm the chair of the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. I would like to begin in a good way and acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. The Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies is committed to leverage our research expertise of humanistic approaches to genocide, historical injustices, and mass violence to create space for dialogue, knowledge co-creation, justice-seeking action, and pathways toward reconciliation. We are delighted and honored to welcome you to today's event, which pairs music and history and includes both a performance by Professor Suzanne Snizek and Dr. Yoomi Kim, and a lecture by Professor Dan Stone, who joins us all the way from London, where he's the director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway at the University of London. Depending on where we are time-wise, we will either have a Q&A session prior or after the conclusion of the lecture. Today's event is co-hosted by the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. We also gratefully acknowledge the support from the UBC Holocaust Education Committee, and here at UVic from the Center for Global Studies, the Department of History, and the School of Music. Now I'm delighted to introduce our two musical performers. A virtuoso flutist, Associate Professor Suzanne Snizek has performed extensively throughout North America, Europe, and Asia. Her groundbreaking research on music in World War II British internment has been published by Böhler Verlag Vienna, Routledge New York, the Council of Europe, Berka New York, Armand Collin Paris, as well as online at the World Ort website, Impact Through Education. In 2016, Dr. Snizek released her critically acclaimed CD entitled Chamber Music Rediscoveries, and subsequently received the 2017 UVic Reach Award for Excellence in Creative Expression. Dr. Snizek's newest recording of solo flute works will be released later this year by Centaur Recording label. Pianist, conductor, and composer Dr. Yoomi Kim received the Doctor of Musical Arts degree in piano performance at the University of Cincinnati, where she also completed her Master of Music degree in conducting with choral emphasis. Dr. Kim holds the Bachelor of Music and Master of Music degrees in piano performance from the Peabody Conservatory of Johns Hopkins University and the University of Montreal, respectively. As a music director, Dr. Kim has taught chamber orchestra, choir, and piano at the Lester B. Pearson United World College of the Pacific, where she has also composed and arranged music for the college's various concerts. As a pianist, she has been teaching at the Victoria Conservatory of Music. I now pass it on to you, Suzanne.
Thank you all for attending today's special recital and lecture. A special thank you to Yoomi Kim for performing with me today, to Dan Stone for making the trek to the island, and Charlotta for her tireless organizational work. So Yoomi and I will be performing two movements of Günter Raphael's Sonata for Flute and Piano, Opus 8. The first movement is an allegretto, and the third movement, which we'll be playing, is a delicately graceful rondo. So this early work was published in 1925, when Raphael was only 22 years old. But the music is extraordinarily mature, I think far beyond what anyone would expect of such a young composer. Raphael's overall trajectory as a musician follows that of many German musicians of this era, namely a deep inheritance and identification with Germanic musical traditions, followed by a post-war exploration of completely new ways of approaching music. This particular sonata, though being an early work, is especially romantic, I would say, akin to Brahms, and quite chromatic like Max Reger's works. But above all, I would say it's highly expressive. I chose to perform Raphael today because I felt his experience reflected some strands of thought in Dan Stone's book, The Holocaust and Unfinished History, which we actually have been using in the course that I'm teaching on issues in suppressed music. Firstly, the legacy of the Holocaust is definitely unfinished in terms of the diminished and delayed reception of suppressed composers from this era, including Raphael. Secondly, the notion that the history of the Holocaust is not synonymous with that of the Nazi concentration camps is also relevant to Raphael's biography. Although there were, of course, many outstanding musicians and artists that did perish in the concentration camps, and names like Pavel Haas, Gideon Klein, Victor Ullmanns, Leo Smit, unfortunately, we lost all of these and many more. Raphael's particular experience was different. He was deeply affected by the racist policies of the Third Reich, however. He lost his faculty position at the Leipzig State Conservatory of Music as a direct result of the employment bans placed on Germans of Jewish descent. Labeled as a half-Jew, Raphael could also no longer have his works performed or published. He suffered from tuberculosis for most of his adult life, but his doctors often protected him while he was in hospital. So ironically, his health condition both saved him inadvertently as well as ended his life prematurely at the age of 57 in 1960. After the war, Raphael struggled to be included in post-war German cultural life. He noted that he helped many of his friends and former colleagues through the denazification process, testifying on their behalf, but there was no process or opportunity for his own cultural reintegration. So this is an important point. Like so many other artists, Raphael never regained the cultural stature he had earned and enjoyed prior to the rise of the Nazi regime. I want to conclude my comments today by encouraging all the musicians in the audience, young and older, to explore and perform the music of Günter Raphael. He was a prodigious composer and literally wrote hundreds of works. Basically, there's something for everyone in his work, except for opera. And so it would be lovely to see his works championed once again. I hope you enjoy this work, the first and last movements from his Sonata Opus 8 for flute and piano. Thank you.
Suzanne and Yoomi, thank you so much for this absolutely beautiful performance. Now it is my great honor to introduce Professor Dan Stone. Dan Stone is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. He's the author of numerous articles and books, including The Liberation of the Camps, The End of the Holocaust and Its Aftermath, Yale, 2015, Concentration Camps, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press, 2019, Fate Unknown, Tracing the Missing After World War II and the Holocaust, this year published with Oxford University Press, and The Holocaust, An Unfinished History, published with Penguin this year and next year forthcoming with Mariner. Forthcoming publications also include Psychoanalysis, Historiography, and the Nazi Camps, Accounting for Survival, to be published with Palgrave in 2024. Dan Stone is a co-editor with Mark Rosman of Volume 1 of the forthcoming Cambridge History of the Holocaust, and is currently writing a book on the Holocaust in Romania. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Stone.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the very kind introduction, and thank you so much to Charlotte and to the other departments involved here who've invited me. It's my first time on the west coast of Canada, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to talk for as long as Charlotte will let me, till she shuts me up, and I'm going to talk about the book and some of the main themes in it, and try to explain to you why, given the enormous size of the scholarly literature on the Holocaust, I wanted to write this book and what I wanted to try and achieve with it. So I'll start actually by just reading a couple of the quotations that I begin the book with, because I think they set the tone for what's to follow. In the diary that she kept in Bergen-Belsen, the young Jewish Yugoslav, Hannah Levy-Haas, writes at one point of a boy whose body has been infested by fleas and who is rejected by his family. This comes from her diary. He couldn't kill the vermin that had settled on his body because he couldn't see them. They've burrowed deep into his skin and swarmed through his eyebrows. His chest is completely blackened by these fleas and their nests. We have never seen such a thing. We never imagined such a thing could occur. Everyone avoids him. His brothers and sisters dread his presence, his fleas, his howling. The other night, he dragged his useless body from one bed to the other, begging people to make room for him. Everyone pushed him away in disgust. Painful story. His case is not unique. This merging of the animal and the human, this deeply traumatic destruction of the self and the revulsion it causes amongst others who fear the same thing happening to them, is an extraordinary description in her diary. In it, we glimpse the nightmarish consequences of Nazi persecution. And my second one comes from one of the stories written in the Łódź ghetto by Isaiah Spiegel. These are in the compelling fiction of the Holocaust. These stories written in the ghetto are some of the very hardest I think I've ever come across to read. In one of them, Spiegel describes a rabbi who at the morning prayers appears to go mad after being mocked by German soldiers in the street. This is what he writes. For a moment, Reb Bunem was paralyzed, overcome by shame and nausea. The blood rushed from his heart into his hands, which began to tremble. His eyes flashed an uncanny green flame. With a surge of preternatural strength, he suddenly turned to the praying Jews and started ripping the prayer books from their hands. The frightened Jews moved off to the side, while Reb Bunem continued tearing the psalm books from their grasp and casting imprecations on their heads. He shouted with the voice of one possessed, while in the darkness of the synagogue, his beet-red face glowed with divine wrath. Jews, stop reciting psalms. God is on the side of our enemy. God is with the Germans. I beseech you, recite no more psalms. Our world is shrouded in darkness. A rabbi desecrates the holy books and pleads with his congregants to abandon their prayers. And I wanted to start with those two vignettes because, in a sense, they point to the fact, I think, that there are still many aspects to the Holocaust that we haven't really grappled with, that the current way in which we remember and commemorate the Holocaust tends, in a way, well-meaning though it might be, to step over some of the more traumatic aspects of the Holocaust and that the story of the Holocaust is not one of redemption, of light in the darkness. It is one of destruction, and that is something that I think we've yet to face full on. So I'll say a little bit about the title of the book, and then I want to focus on several what I think are misperceptions about the Holocaust that are quite pervasive in our culture. And when I say our, I mean, I think Western English-speaking and Western European culture. And then I'll mention several particular themes. And the misperceptions that I want to focus on are concerning the victims of the Holocaust, Germans and Jews, the claim or the understanding of concentration camps in the role of the Holocaust, and finally the significance of the so-called death marches and the sub-camps, two of the most neglected and complex themes of this history. So I'll say something a little bit about the title, An Unfinished History. I think what Suzanne said just now alluded to one of the significances of this title, but it has two meanings for me, I think. The first is a historiographical point, a scholarly point, which is that, contrary to what one might expect, the subjects that give rise to the most literature are the ones that continue to produce more literature. So there's a sort of paradox. You might think that in a subject like the Holocaust, for which we have a vast amount of scholarly literature, we don't need any more books. We have lots of good histories, lots of studies in many other disciplines as well. Surely we know everything we need to know about the Holocaust. The point is that I think for as long as a topic such as this one remains emotionally, politically and culturally compelling, it continues to generate more and more literature. And of course, for me, writing now, it's different from one of my colleagues writing 10 or 20 years ago. In my opinion, all history is contemporary history in the sense that the research questions that we ask, the way in which we go about our research, the methodologies we use, are shaped to a very large extent by who we are and our situatedness in the present. And so writing a book such as this now, or not now, but in the last couple of years, I think in the context of not just the post-Cold War years, but the rise of the right in the United States, Brexit, the challenge of climate change, the concept of the Anthropocene, and so on. These are settings that lead to a different sort of understanding of the Holocaust than ones that were written by historians maybe only 10 years previously. So in that sense, history is always unfinished. The way in which the present throws up new questions tends to drive the way that we approach this subject in new ways. Secondly, I think the concept of unfinishedness has a historical significance. And again, it relates to what Suzanne just said. That's to say that the Holocaust did not simply end on the 8th of May 1945. But obviously for the survivors, I think most of them were, of course, amazed and pleased to have outlived the Nazi regime, something most of them thought would never happen. But then they immediately faced a whole new set of problems. Many of them were the sole survivors of their families, of their communities, who then faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in new countries, learning new languages, all the while being both physically and, for most of them, for most of the rest of their lives, mentally ill in one way or another. There are many studies of Holocaust survivors that focus on their resilience, psychologically speaking, but the incidence of trauma was something that went through their whole lives, and we now, of course, have studies of the intergenerational transmission of trauma as well. The consequences of that mean that Holocaust memory, something I'll come to a little later, that's by which I mean the way in which the after effects of the Holocaust continue to be felt after 1945, is something that is very live. We can trace stages of Holocaust memory relating to things like trials or films or political events, scandals and so on, up until the present. And I, of course, do not need to emphasize the current circumstances, what's going on in Israel, and the relationship between Holocaust memory and Israeli and Middle Eastern politics more generally. So in that sense, the Holocaust remains unfinished in lots of different ways, and I think that will continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. There may well come a point at which the current trend for Holocaust museums, for commemoration and so on, is different from how it looks now, but we don't know. For the time being, it shows no sign of slowing down. So the first theme that I wanted to talk about, where I see considerable misunderstanding of the Holocaust, I think particularly in Western Europe and in the English-speaking world, not so much in Eastern Europe, is a kind of understanding that thinks in terms of Germans and Jews. There is, of course, good reason for this. The Third Reich was a German regime, including Austria, after 1938, and the first, from 1933 to 1939, the history of that regime concerns Germans and Jews. But, of course, these concepts, these two categories, are not in themselves mutually exclusive. The German Jews understood themselves as both, of course. And secondly, my main point here is to say that the German Jews constituted no more than maybe at most 5% of the victims of the Holocaust. The focus on the German Jews, Anne Frank obviously is the most famous example, but many others who come to mind, comes from the fact that the size of the German Jewish refugee community in the UK, in the United States, in Canada and elsewhere, meant that these were the people who set the scene for the émigré discussion of what Nazism meant, and whose influence politically and in terms of scholarly production was hugely important. But the German Jews were a very small percentage of the actual victims of the Holocaust. The vast majority of those who died in the Holocaust were Jews from Eastern Europe, those who lived in the former Pale of Settlement of the Tsarist Empire, and it remains the case that if you look at the Yad Vashem or USHMM database of names of Holocaust victims, there are about I can't remember the exact figure, 4.5 million names there, which means that there are over 1 million people whose names we do not even know. So we have a kind of a canon of famous authors and representative figures from the Holocaust, but we still have failed to grasp, I think, the fact that the true destruction of the Holocaust was primarily focused on Eastern Europe. Largely poor, shtetl-dwelling, Yiddish-speaking communities, in many cases that were entirely wiped out with no survivors, which is why we cannot name anybody who came from those places. That leads to a bigger discussion about victims and collaborators, and I'll come back to that shortly. The second thing I wanted to correct is the use of the term concentration camp for thinking about the Holocaust. This, I think, is a very common way of thinking. We talk about the concentration camps with respect to the victims of the Holocaust. In fact, and this is a kind of technical, institutional point, from the perspective of the perpetrators, not necessarily the one that we want to take, but nevertheless important, from the perspective of the perpetrators, the concentration camp system, that's to say the camps run by the SS's Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, had almost nothing to do with the Holocaust, i.e. the murder of the Jews qua Jews. The concentration camps set up between 1933 and 1939, starting with Dachau and on with Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, and so on. These were camps set up in the first instance to incarcerate those considered political enemies of Nazism, communists and social democrats in the first instance, and including some Jews among them, but they were not targeted as Jews, but as communists or social democrats. And then secondly, from the mid-1930s onwards, when the camps were actually falling into desuetude and Himmler wanted to do something to revive them, the main victims at that point were so-called asocials, groups of people like gypsies or Roma, vagrants, beggars, prostitutes, and so on, members of Aryan society who were being swept up in order to create a sense of order within the society of the Third Reich. The only time before the war that Jews as such were targeted as victims of concentration camps was after the November pogrom, or Kristallnacht, in November 1938, when, after that attack on the Jews, some 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to Dachau, Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Some of them died there. The vast majority were released after a few months on the promise that they would leave the country, which obviously at that point they no longer needed any encouragement to do. And at that point, the concentration camps became, after the start of the war, were places for the collection of political prisoners from Poland, Bohemia and Moravia, and other places. The only real connection with what we would now call the Holocaust was the fact that guards were trained at Dachau, who then were subsequently used in other settings. The camps that we think of as synonymous with the genocide of the Jews, particularly the extermination camps of Chełmno, Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec, these were not run by the inspectors of concentration camps, nor were they concentration camps. When we talk about those places, nobody was concentrated there. These are places that people were sent and were murdered. That's it. They were very small. There were no real fixed installations there. There were tiny numbers of so-called work Jews who were forced to do things to maintain the camps, the carpentry and so on. But for the most part, these were not places of long-term incarceration and punishment in the way that the kind of model of a concentration camp like Dachau was. The exceptions are Auschwitz and Majdanek, which combined the functions of concentration camp, extermination camp, and slave labor. And those places cross over between the functions of these different sites. But for the most part, the concentration camp system, until late in the war, was not part of what we would now call the Holocaust. Why then are we making this mistake? And the answer, I suppose, is that in a way it's not a mistake. It's a sort of institutional perspective. But at the end of the war, when the camps were liberated, the American, British and Canadian soldiers involved in the liberation of the camps discovered Jews in large numbers precisely in those places I've mentioned. Dachau, Belsen, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, etc. And the reason that there were large numbers of Jews there and dying in huge numbers was because these were people who had been sent on death marches, so evacuated from camps further east in the face of the advance of the Red Army, and who were dumped in the camps in the interior of Germany that had still not yet been conquered. So when the British arrived at Belsen in April 1945, what they discovered was effectively a small town, 10,000 corpses on the streets and 50,000 dying inmates in the camp. This is why, for many present in and shortly after the liberation, they understood Belsen as a death camp, and why survivors of Belsen talk about it or wrote about it as a death camp. And in a way, Belsen, in the very last weeks and months of the war, was functioning like a death camp. But it was not, institutionally speaking, it was not one. And so the Holocaust should not be understood as synonymous with concentration camps, nor did actually the majority of the victims of the Holocaust die in camps. What's now called the Holocaust by bullets, the shooting, the face-to-face shooting of about 1.5 million Jews in Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union, was the first stage of what then developed into the final solution. About 500,000 Jews died in ghettos, and many others died in all sorts of other settings. And so what I've tried to do in the book is to try and show all these different sites, to draw on some of the insights from the so-called spatial turn in Holocaust studies, the emphasis on geographies or landscapes and different sites of incarceration, the idea of movement between sites, and to show that the simplistic model of the Holocaust as concentration, deportation and murder does not really capture the whole picture. That leads me to the third topic that I want to talk about, which I've spoken as a kind of misperception. Actually, it might be better to say something that has been unaddressed at all, really, in the literature in a meaningful way, and that's the death marches that I already mentioned and the subcamps. These are a real problem for a particular narrative of the Holocaust. If our narrative is precisely this one that I just mentioned, the Nazis concentrate, deport and then murder the Jews. How then do we explain the death marches at the end of the war, and how do we explain the creation of the subcamps towards the end of the war? I'll take the subcamps first because it makes more sense chronologically speaking. So, the Nazis' attitude towards Jews by the time that the final solution was in place, let's say by the end of 1941, spring of 1942, was that Jews everywhere the Nazis could get hold of them were to be murdered. And yet, at the end of the war, particularly in the summer and autumn of 1944, we suddenly see the creation of a huge number of slave labour subcamps. In other words, small camps attached to usually factories from which, at which Jews taken from either the surviving Łódź ghetto or Auschwitz were transferred to work as slave labourers. And in a sense, it doesn't compute, because if Jews were to be murdered, why were they being then sent to work in these slave labour camps? The answer is actually simple. The Third Reich had run out of manpower. All German men that were able to were conscripted, were fighting in the Wehrmacht. German women had taken their places in factories and in agriculture. The Germans had rounded up something like 13 million foreign forced labourers, not to be confused with concentration camp slave labourers, but people taken primarily from Ukraine, Yugoslavia, but also parts of Western Europe to work as forced labourers in Germany, and yet they still had a shortage of labour. And so in the desperate straits that the German war economy was in at the end of the war, the decision was made to recruit Jews from Auschwitz and elsewhere and send them to these camps. So the main camps, Dachau, Mauthausen, and so on, at the end of the war, mushroomed into centres controlling, in some cases, over 100 of these small subcamps. And there's a book to be written about the subcamp system, because the names of these places barely resonate, I think, in most countries around the world. Eintrachthütte, Janinagruber, Christianstadt, Neudax. These were concentration camps, but who's heard of them? In some instances, there are physical remains of buildings, barracks, and so on. In others, there are memorials, plaques commemorating the fact that these sites existed. In others, there are nothing. Some of them were enormous. Christianstadt, that I just mentioned, for example, was a subcamp of Gross-Rosen, at which it was a women's camp. And the factories that made up the camp are today falling down in the forests of southwest Poland. So the nearest large city is Wrocław, that used to be Breslau in the German Empire, and these sites are forgotten, but are still there. And the Jews who were taken to work in them, the fact that they were sent there essentially saved their lives. We should not misunderstand what was happening. The Germans did not decide they were going to save these people. Rather, they were delaying their deaths. It was a desperate measure to say, we're going to take these people, set them to work, and then when we don't need them anymore, we're going to kill them then. Actually, the death rate in the camps themselves was remarkably low. It varies from site to site, and depending on what sort of work people were doing, whether they were working with dangerous chemicals or out in cold water or whatever. But for the most part, the survival rate was much higher than it was at the main camps, and certainly, obviously, much higher than at the death camps. And the fact that the Jews who were taken there, who are often figured as men and women in the literature, but actually when you look at who they were, in many cases were still children, teenagers, 14 to 18 years old. They were being fed and accommodated in a slightly better way than they might have been had they been at Auschwitz, and this fact meant that they were slightly fitter physically and better able to withstand the death marches and the last phases of the war. And so in a sense, the subcamps saved their lives. It's this totally contingent. Everything to do with survival ultimately is contingent. Had the British arrived at Belsen 2, 3, 4 weeks later, everybody would have been dead there. There was no food and no water. But the fact that some people did survive has to do with where they were sent in the months before the spring of 1945. The death marches, then, are another difficult concept. All of these places I've mentioned, and perhaps Gross Rosen is the best example. I think of all the main camps, Gross Rosen is perhaps the least well known in the English-speaking world. And it's, again, also a camp that's today inside the borders of Poland, but part of not quite Silesia in western Poland. But by the end of the war, Gross Rosen contained, and it's about 100 subcamps, contained about 77,000 inmates. In other words, about 11% of the total concentration camp population in January 1945. Those subcamps varied from underground tunnel construction in the Aal Mountains, the Eulen Mountains, to create kind of fortifications for bunkers and so on, for redoubts for the Third Reich, through to working with chemicals, armaments, and parts production for aircraft factories and so on. One of them was Oskar Schindler's factory. So these places were, of course, unpleasant, but when you read the reports of surviving Jews who were in them, you see that they describe them in some ways as like holiday camps. They say, oh, after Auschwitz, it was extraordinary arriving at this place. There were straw mattresses and there was food and the overseer didn't beat us. And this is, I think, one of the things that's very hard to grasp. When the death marches came along and these places were evacuated in different stages, what happened was the camp inmates were all forcibly evacuated westwards, sometimes by foot, sometimes by train, and in some cases, for example, the case of Stutthof outside Gdansk or Danzig on the Baltic Sea, by barge, in a particularly horrific set of circumstances with many people killed. The concentration camp inmates then in January 1945 numbered about 714,000, by no means all Jews. Lots of non-Jewish camp inmates from Hungary and Soviet Union and elsewhere. And the death marches have been described by historians in many different ways. What happened was that as the camp inmates were evacuated, they started to be shot if they couldn't keep up. And historians have really struggled to understand what was going on here. One historian describes them as the last stage of the Holocaust. But it wasn't the last stage of the Holocaust, because if the Nazis had wanted to kill everybody, they could have done. And yet they didn't. They shot people willy-nilly as they wanted to across and the whole landscape of Central Europe was littered with the corpses of the inmates on what had essentially become mobile or marching concentration camps. But they didn't kill everybody. And so it's quite hard to understand what was happening. I think what you see with the death marches is a kind of, it's really hard to, I hate using terms like madness to describe the Third Reich because it's not a very useful analytic concept, but you see the kind of chaos in the final stages of the Third Reich when humiliation, rage, anger and shame were setting in amongst the perpetrators. Nobody really knew what was going on. Nobody knew exactly what they were supposed to do with these people. They only knew that there was an instruction from Himmler that said the Jews should not fall alive into enemy hands. And so they were moving these people around across Europe and eventually dumping them in one of the camps that still existed in the Third Reich. So in the book, I've tried to account for the death marches in a way which captures something of the kind of crazy atmosphere going on, but also tries to analyze them in terms of how we should understand them within the historiography of the Holocaust. So, those are, I think, some of the key misperceptions. I also wanted to emphasize certain particular themes in this book. There are, as I said at the start, there's a plentiful literature on the Holocaust, but I think in recent years we've seen the production of some very large synthetic narrative histories of the Holocaust by Longerich, Browning, and so on. And there are some very thin kind of student guides to the Holocaust, all of which have their merits. But what I wanted to do with this book was to write something that was accessible to the general reader, informed by recent scholarly work, but in which that historiography was implicit rather than explicit, which provides a narrative of events, but also a stepping back and an analytical explanation of what I'm talking about at the same time. Saul Friedlander, in many of his theoretical essays about Holocaust historiography, talks about how the historian should interrupt his narrative so that you don't get the sense that the history has written itself, so that you're reminded of the fact that this is a constructed text, it's just one interpretation. And that's something I've tried to do. I've tried to, on the one hand, write a readable account of what was happening, but also to interrupt the account and say, and provide a kind of explanatory framework for it. And that explanatory framework is based around several themes, and those are what I want to talk about now. And they include the significance of Nazi ideology, the role of collaboration, and the significance of the aftermath of the Holocaust. The first one, Nazi ideology, might seem like an obvious statement. We can't really understand the Holocaust without ideology. And yet, many of you here will be familiar with the so-called intentionalist-functionalist debate, this long-running debate about whether the Nazis decided to kill the Jews because they'd always intended to do so, or whether the final solution was a program that came about in a more ad hoc fashion. And by stressing ideology, I'm not proposing a return to a kind of simplistic intentionalist reading which says Hitler always wanted to murder the Jews and so that's what the Nazis did. That, I think, is completely untenable. The success of the functionalist narrative is to show us that Nazi policy was often made on the hoof, it was ad hoc, reactive, it was shaped by the military circumstances. Obviously, the Jews of Hungary could not be deported until the Nazis occupied Hungary in 1944. The same is true of the Jews of northern Italy, or of Crete, or of Rhodes, or of Salonika. All of these situations depended on the military situation. What I'm trying to get at is I've tried to provide a narrative that is, on the one hand, accounts for the gradual radicalization of Nazi policy, but shows how it was at the same time shaped by what the functionalists would call, I suppose, ad hoc or contingent factors. However, that said, if you go down the functionalist route in a logical fashion, you end up at a situation where you forget why the Nazis were persecuting a particular group of people in the first place. And if we want to understand why, in 1943, the Nazis deported the Jews of Salonika, and why in 1944 they deported the Jews of Hungary, we can say, yes, it depended on the military situation, but why were they attacking the Jews at all? Then you have to return to Nazi ideology. And what I wanted to, the first few chapters in the book, go into some detail about race science and race mysticism, these different concepts of racist thinking in the Third Reich, in order to try and make the case that although the functionalist argument is important, there are contingent circumstances that shaped the particular ways in which the final solution played out. The point is that from the very beginning, Nazi ideology contained within itself an apocalyptic, destructive, self-destructive time bomb. That the very first Nazi Party program, 1920, has within it the words, only those of German or kindred blood can be citizens. No Jew, therefore, can be a citizen. And in other words, there isn't a blueprint for murder. There's no written plan for what we would now call the final solution in 1920 or in 1925 or in 1933 or in 1938. But what there is an incipient genocidal fantasy. Alon Confino talks about this as a world without Jews. In other words, from the very start, the Nazis have this fantasy of creating a world in which the Jews no longer exist. And the ways in which the persecution of the Jews is radicalized, is shaped by contingent circumstances, but it is always informed by this apocalyptic genocidal fantasy. And that's something that I've tried to bring out very strongly. And I've done so by looking at what I call race science on the one hand and race mysticism on the other. One of the, I think, fallacies of our contemporary discussion is that the final solution emerged out of eugenics or race science. This is not an advocacy for eugenics by any means. What it is to say that the race scientists in Nazi Germany played a particular role, but the idea for the murder of the Jews did not come from the anthropologists, the geneticists, the biologists, and so on, even though they, for the most part, threw their lot in with the Third Reich because they were attracted by Nazi ideas about race and they could get funding for what they wanted to do. The persecution of the Jews, I think, has a different timeline from, let's say, the attack on the disabled or the euthanasia program in the Third Reich. The attack on the Jews was not based on the fact that, as the disabled were perceived by the Nazis, that they were a threat to the purity of the Aryan race. This was not a kind of cleansing, racial cleansing. The attack on the Jews was based more on a paranoid, racist conspiracy theory about not about Jewish inferiority, but about the Jewish threat. The Jews as controllers of communism and of capitalism, the Jews as the puppet masters of world politics, and so on. And this strain of race mysticism certainly allowed the race scientists to thrive, but it was based on a whole set of presuppositions that had nothing to do with science. And I'll give you one of my favorite quotations. Comes from Ernst Krieg, who was a Nazi philosopher, who had the following to say about race. Let me see, let me find the right quotation for you. We have learned from Chamberlain's, and especially from the Führer's teachings, that the verification of the existence of race, and perhaps of existence in general, does not require artificial scientific tools. The fact of the existence of race is not doubtful because man carries it in his heart, his spirit, his soul, or because man wants race to become a fact. And that, I think, is the starting point for the Nazis' concept of the Jews, that they wanted to believe in race. They wanted to believe in the superiority of the Aryan race, and they wanted to believe that the counter-image of this notion of Aryan superiority was the Jew. And when I talk about Nazism as a kind of an apocalyptic philosophy, that's because Nazism contains within itself a philosophy of history that is about the clash between good and evil, which is figured as the clash between Aryan and non-Aryan, Aryan and Jew. And that this means that for Hitler and the leading Nazis, the movement of history was understood as a struggle between these different forces. And this can only lead in one direction. So it's no surprise that one of the commentators that I cite in the book, Eric Fergelin, one of the most important writers from the period, described Nazism as a system of scientific superstition. I think that's one of the most brilliant summaries of Nazism that you'll come across, a system of scientific superstition. And this juxtaposition of science and superstition captures, I think, perfectly what was going on. The second theme that I want to talk about is collaboration. And this is a much more, occurs at a much more shabby, kind of sublunary level than the sort of philosophical text that I've just been talking about. Again, I need to be very clear here that I've placed a lot of emphasis in the book on the Holocaust as a pan-European crime. I've made the argument in the book that the success of the Germans in killing Jews everywhere owed a great deal to local collaboration of individuals, institutions, agencies, and states. But I think it's also very important to remember that the vast majority of Jews killed in the Holocaust were killed by Germans, by which I mean also Austrians, and that had there not been this project driven by Berlin, the Jews of Romania, Hungary, Greece, Slovakia, and so on would not have been killed, I think. It's perfectly clear to say. So this was a German-led project. However, it chimed with the aspirations of many authoritarian, on the line towards fascist regimes across Europe at this point in time. If you look at the regimes of Tiso in Slovakia, of Horthy in Hungary, and particularly of Antonescu in Romania, you see regimes based on ethno-nationalist ideas of racial and national homogeneity. The opportunity presents itself during the war for these regimes to follow the Germans' example and to cleanse, as they would put it, their societies of unwanted elements. The role of collaboration, then, I think, is extremely important, not least, first of all, for understanding the history of the Holocaust, secondly, for understanding today the memory politics in Europe and the ressentiment of right-wing nationalist movements from France to the Baltic states, in which the memory of World War II is mobilized as a way of defending national honor and of reinforcing a kind of anti-communist come anti-Semitic narrative about the modern world. The best example, I think, here is Romania, and I'd like to spend a few minutes on that because I'm going to write more about it. The cases I've cited so far, if you think of Vichy France or Norway under Quisling, Slovakia and so on, these are all regimes that are in the German orbit, either occupied by the Germans, as in Norway, or set up as independent states, but quite firmly more or less controlled by Germany, as in the case of Croatia or Slovakia. Romania, however, was an independent state during World War II. It was allied with the Third Reich, but it was not directed by Berlin. Bucharest remained the master of its own destinies, partly because the Germans relied on Romanian oil and needed to, they of course influenced Romanian politics, but Romania, in terms of its participation in the Holocaust, was not simply doing what the Germans told it to do. The Holocaust in Romania, I think, in the English-speaking world, remains fairly unknown. And that's, I think, largely to do with the particular circumstances of Romania's post-war history, its incorporation into one of the most brutal communist regimes, particularly by the 1980s under Ceausescu, and the shift of blame under that regime onto the Hungarians. So that because northern Transylvania was under Hungarian control during World War II, it was very easy for the Romanian regime under the communist period to say, oh yeah, the Jews from Romania were deported by the Hungarians and shipped to Auschwitz. This was true for the Jews of northern Transylvania. It was a convenient way of forgetting the fact that the Romanians themselves had been responsible for deporting Jews from parts of Romania, from Bukovina in the north and from Bessarabia in the east, what's today more or less the Republic of Moldova, and deporting them into a slice of Ukraine between the Dniester and Bug rivers that they called Transnistria. Not to be confused with the breakaway region of Moldova today that calls itself Transnistria. That's a different thing altogether. I won't go there because it's too complicated. But the Romanians occupied this bit of Ukrainian territory. The Romanian army, after the Wehrmacht, was the second largest Axis force to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the aim, Antonescu's aim, was by being a good ally to the Third Reich, he hoped that he would win back territory lost to Hungary in 1940. At the same time, it was an opportunity, and Antonescu's speeches from this period are absolutely full of his ideas about racial purification. He quite clearly saw the German-led project as an opportunity to get rid of the Jews of Romania and to dump them in the hands of the Germans. When the Romanians occupied Transnistria, they deported the Jews from Romania to that region, and they were faced with the local Jews there, the largest population of which was the Jews of Odessa, several 100,000 Jews there. The Romanians' original intention was to deport these Jews across the Bug into German-occupied Ukraine. The Germans didn't want them. they had their hands full, they said. They didn't want any more Jews to take care of. They said, take care of them yourselves. And so there was no Romanian plan for the final solution, as some historians used to claim decades ago. What happened was the huge numbers of Jews that were suddenly on Romanian-occupied Ukrainian territory were dumped by the Romanians in makeshift camps and ghettos. And when we talk about camps and ghettos here, you should not have Dachau in your mind as what these places looked like. Many of them were former kolkhozes or Soviet agricultural communities. Jews were dumped in pigsties, in stables, barns, and so on, and left to fend for themselves. So the reports from these places are of Jews dying, trading their clothes for food, dying in the freezing temperatures of the winter of 1941. In the autumn of 1942, the Antonescu regime changed its mind, could see which way the wind was blowing geopolitically, and the majority of the Jews of Bucharest and Old Romania, as well as the Jews from the Banat in the west of Romania, were not deported. And so at the end of the war, the largest surviving Jewish community in Europe was in Romania. And so the myth grew in communist Romania that the Romanians had saved the Jews, which was, of course, true, but also neglected to mention the fact that before they decided to save the Jews, they'd murdered 350,000 of them. And that side of things, I think, has been forgotten, is very contentious in contemporary Romania, where ethno-nationalism remains a serious problem, and is something that needs to be remembered because the names of these places have very little resonance. The single largest massacre of the Holocaust took place not at Babi Yar outside Kiev, not at Operation Harvest Festival in Majdanek in 1943, but in a small place called Bogdanovka on the Bug River in what's today Ukraine. In Christmas, New Year, 1941, 1942, under Romanian control, but with the assistance of Ukrainian shooters, some 48,000 Jews were shot over a period of a couple of weeks. If you say this today in Romania, the backlash is predictable and quite striking. So after this book was published, there was some discussion in the Romanian press and in Romanian social media, and some of the comments were, if they weren't so outrageous, funny. Things like, "Don't be absurd, the Romanian army didn't even have 48,000 bullets," stuff like that, which plays into a kind of notion of Romanian primitiveness, which, if it came from a Western European historian, would be rightly condemned as Orientalist, but coming from Romanian nationalists is okay because it's a kind of way of defending national honour. But the sources are very clear, and this history is one that needs to be much better known. Names of places like Bogdanovka, but also camps like Vapniaka, and ghettos, Akhmechetka, Domanovka, and others are all places that I intend to bring to greater attention. The final thing, how am I doing for time? The final thing I want to talk about is then the aftermath issues: Holocaust memory, Holocaust education, and commemoration. As I said, the Holocaust did not simply end in 1945. Historians now are writing a huge amount about the post-liberation period, what happened to the survivors, the creation of displaced persons camps, which existed for years after the war, the tracing of missing people that was such an important motivation for survivors after the war, the significance of refugees and DPs for the creation of what we today recognize as the architecture of human rights legislation, of the UN Refugee Convention, and so on. The forerunner of today's UNHCR was the International Refugee Organization, and before that the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And these were bodies that helped not just Jews, but survivors of the Holocaust, but also displaced persons from across Europe who were in Germany at the end of the war, be repatriated or resettled in a third country. The reason why there are large numbers of Ukrainians in Canada has to do with the resettlement of Eastern Europeans after 1945 through these organizations. And lots of lots of historians are now writing about these aftermath issues, and that goes up to the present. So the history of the ways in which the Holocaust has shaped contemporary politics and culture over the decades is itself part of the history of the Holocaust, in my opinion. Finally, just to close, I'll say a few words about Holocaust education and commemoration, because the moment that we're in now is an interesting one. There's more interest in the Holocaust than there ever has been. New museums are still being built in Bucharest, in Amsterdam, and elsewhere. There's a lot of resources being devoted to shaping archives, to commemorative projects, and so on. At the same time, we see the world sliding in all sorts of directions that we thought would be impossible. The drift of the Republican Party in the US into fascism, Brexit, look at what's happening in Israel, Netanyahu, and there are members of the Netanyahu cabinet who, if they were in power here or in the UK, we would be terrified. This is a very complicated scenario. What's going on when someone like Netanyahu is allied or friends with Viktor Orban in Hungary? It's a very bizarre landscape of Holocaust memory that we inhabit now. The call for Holocaust education is on the one hand fine. I have nothing against it. Of course, I think people should learn about the Holocaust. I teach the Holocaust at the university, so of course I think people should learn about it. But the idea that drives the motivation behind much Holocaust education, that it's going to make people into nicer people, it's going to solve the world's problems because people will understand hatred and prejudice and so on, I think we've got some way to go yet before that presupposition is proven. I think with that, maybe I'll stop there, and hopefully we've got time for a few questions. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this incredible presentation without notes, if I may say. Now we have 6 minutes, about 6 minutes for Q&A. I want to say, if you have questions for Dan and also for Suzanne, both generously and kindly agreed to stick around a little bit, so please also feel free to approach both of them. Scott, you're managing the microphone. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. Question right away here. Janine.
Hello, thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. I wanted just to maybe ask you to talk a bit more about your last point. I'm working on Holocaust education, so I'm more interested in your thoughts about that. And I wanted to ask you about your thoughts of bringing together these two parts. On the one hand, making this history more complicated and more complex and going away from this big narrative and, like you said it, like deportation, concentration, murder. And on the other side, trying to educate young people about that who cannot maybe grasp this complexity. Or maybe they can, but if we have like 1 week in a school year, you know, how do you make this history complicated and relevant at the same time in educational settings? Easy question.
My get out is to say, I teach at a university, I don't teach at school level. That's not my problem, that's for somebody else to work out, right? However, that is a cop-out, I'm aware of that. So I would only say, I think that the inspiration for Holocaust education needs to be thought about very carefully. Which discipline is it taught in? What are the aims of teaching it? So if you want to teach kids about the Holocaust in order to teach them lessons about anti-bullying, I would say, don't bother. There are many ways that we can teach children that bullying is wrong without them having to learn about gas chambers and the murder of 1.5 million children. And they don't need to be brutalized with those kinds of images and stories in order to learn that bullying is a bad thing. There are also ways of teaching about tolerance, prejudice, religious, racial prejudice, and so on, without necessarily having to appeal to the Holocaust. I think it's scaremongering in a sense if we think that every time somebody uses a slanderous word in the playground that we're on the slippery slope to genocide. I mean, They're two different things. So I think the challenge is to say, what are we learning this for? I think it should be taught either in history or in religious studies with the aim simply of teaching it. So this is part of modern history. It's one of the defining events of modern world history, and what you do with it then is up to you to think about. I think if we tell children they have to learn about the Holocaust because they're going to become more tolerant of other people, we're then going to be shocked when 700,000, or what was the figure? 70 million people voted for Trump. We shouldn't really be shocked. One of the things I've said here and elsewhere is that I think we often ask too much of Holocaust education. We can't assume that teaching people about the Holocaust is going to make the world a nicer place. We first have to make the world a nicer place, and then it'll be a world fit for students to receive whatever messages we think are coming from Holocaust education. Because at the moment, there's no guarantee that... I mean, I've thought this... I used to teach a course on genocide. I haven't taught it for some time. But it was a kind of week by week. It was like a how-to guide. In the end, I thought, what is going on? Why am I doing this? And so there's no guarantee that when we teach about the Holocaust, school kids are not absorbing the message that, as Hannah Arendt said, that Jews are people who are fit to inhabit camps. So I'll leave it open. I don't really know the answer to your question, but I know it's an extremely challenging problem.
Thank you, Dan. Other questions also for Suzanne? Yes, Dan, please. The microphone is coming this way.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. You mentioned that you didn't want to use the concept, the word madness, to explain Nazi ideology. I wonder if you would be willing to revise that a bit, or the future. I'm thinking about what's going on now. It's October 7th, and the rise of this kind of irrationality going on in many quarters, and how political and religious passions blind people. So, would you say, well, maybe madness will not explain everything, but there's something to it?
Yeah,
that's my question.
I'm afraid I have to agree. Yes, there is a kind of slide into irrationality, and what's so hard to understand is, Marx talked about the first time as tragedy, second time as farce, and what we see is the kind of reverse going on now, that we've learned all this stuff about the modern experience, and yet we're doing it again. There's something very perverse in human nature that is at work, and that's kind of beyond the scope of a historian. That's venturing into territory of psychology or sociology, dynamics of social behavior. But there's something very troubling going on, and madness. There's a kind of collective psychosis sometimes at play, and I think that the world that we live in now, with the threat of climate change and so on, pandemics and such, is going to mean that that sort of, how to contain that sort of madness is going to be our problem for the coming generations.
We are unfortunately officially out of time. If you have any more questions for Dan Stone or Suzanne Snizek, please stick around. I just want to thank Suzanne, Yoomi, for this incredibly beautiful, moving performance, Dan for a truly thought-provoking presentation. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you all for coming and joining us today. Thank you.